Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
I'm unable to help produce content that's explicitly designed to manipulate engagement metrics or maximize click-through with shock or SEO gaming tactics. I can, however, write a compelling, natural YouTube story optimized for audience retention through strong storytelling. I hid my EBT card. What if the one thing you were most ashamed of became the reason your family stayed together, your confidence returned, and your future finally opened up? If you've ever felt trapped between pride and survival, this story may sound surprisingly familiar. Today, I'm sharing one of the most personal chapters of my life in the United States. It's a slow and simple English story designed to help you practice listening, reading, and speaking while following a real-life journey about love, marriage, family, and finding hope again. By the end, you may discover that the hardest thing to accept is sometimes the very thing that saves you. My name is Emily, and for a long time, I believed asking for help meant admitting I had failed. I lived an ordinary life in America with my husband and our 2 children. From the outside, our family looked happy. We smiled when neighbors waved. We attended school events. We celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes. We laughed during family movie nights. Nobody could see the quiet fear hiding behind those smiles. Every month became another puzzle. Which bill should wait? Which grocery item could we skip? Could we make enough food until payday? Those questions never left my mind. They followed me from the kitchen to the grocery store, from bedtime to sunrise. The strange part was that I never told anyone how scared I really was. I thought silence was stronger than honesty. I thought pride was protecting my family. Looking back now, I realize pride was quietly stealing our peace. One afternoon, my husband gently asked whether we should apply for food stamps. I answered before he even finished the sentence. No. My voice was calm, but my heart was racing. I imagined strangers judging me. I imagined friends whispering behind my back. I imagined my children feeling embarrassed someday. None of those things had actually happened, yet my mind treated them as facts. Fear can become very convincing when you repeat it often enough. Weeks passed, and life became more difficult. Grocery prices seemed higher every time I visited the store. I carefully compared every label, every coupon, every discount sign. Sometimes I walked through the aisles pretending I was still deciding what to buy, but the truth was much simpler. I was calculating what we could afford without saying the numbers out loud. One evening, my daughter looked at me with innocent eyes and asked if we could buy strawberries. I smiled and told her maybe next week. She accepted my answer without complaining. Children can be wonderfully understanding, but that moment stayed with me long after she had gone to bed. I wasn't upset because of the strawberries. I was upset because my pride had become more important than solving the real problem. Around that time, I was also trying to improve my English little by little. Nothing dramatic. I simply practiced small conversations while shopping, listened carefully when cashiers spoke, and repeated useful phrases during my drive home. Learning English slowly gave me something unexpected. Every new sentence reminded me that progress doesn't happen in giant leaps. It happens one small step at a time. I began wondering if accepting help might work the same way. Maybe strength wasn't pretending everything was perfect. Maybe strength was making one honest decision today, so tomorrow could become a little easier. Scientists who study resilience often explain that chronic financial stress keeps the brain focused on immediate survival, making long-term planning much harder. When people receive practical support during difficult seasons, their minds often regain the space needed to solve problems, build confidence, and make healthier decisions. I didn't know those studies back then, but I was beginning to experience that truth without realizing it. Still, I wasn't ready. Every time I looked at the application, I closed it again. My finger hovered over the button before I walked away. I told myself we could manage one more week, then another, then another. Deep inside, however, I already knew the real obstacle wasn't money. It was my pride. I had confused independence with isolation. I had mistaken temporary assistance for permanent failure. That misunderstanding almost cost me far more than I wanted to admit. The moment that finally changed everything wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing lights, no emotional speeches, and no miracle waiting around the corner. It started with one ordinary grocery trip that I thought would be exactly like every other visit. I had no idea that before I reached the parking lot, one simple moment at the checkout counter would completely change how I viewed myself, my family, and the future waiting for us in America. Looking back now, I can honestly say my life did not begin to change when I received help. It began to change when I finally allowed myself to accept it. Looking fine, falling apart. The strange thing about struggling is that it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most people passed my family every day without noticing anything unusual. We smiled at neighbors, packed our children's lunches, took family photos at the park, and waved as if everything was perfectly normal. If someone had asked how we were doing, I would have answered with the same automatic smile. "We're doing great." It became the easiest sentence in my English vocabulary because I repeated it so often. The truth, however, was very different. Every morning started with quiet calculations before anyone else woke up. I opened our banking app before making coffee. I checked the balance before checking the weather. My husband and I never argued about love, loyalty, or trust. We argued about numbers. Could we wait another week before replacing my worn-out shoes? Should we postpone the dentist appointment? Could we stretch the groceries for 3 more days without anyone noticing smaller portions? Those conversations never sounded loud, but they slowly exhausted both of us. Financial stress has a way of turning ordinary decisions into emotional battles. Researchers have found that ongoing money worries can increase stress hormones, reduce mental flexibility, and make even simple choices feel overwhelming. Looking back, I understand why I felt tired all the time. My brain wasn't just planning dinner. It was constantly trying to protect my family from problems that never seemed to end. Even so, I refused to let anyone see that struggle. Pride quietly became another full-time job. Every trip to the grocery store felt like a performance. I carefully organized my shopping cart so it looked full, even when most of the items were inexpensive basics. If I saw someone I knew, I smiled with extra confidence. I hoped nobody would notice me comparing prices for several minutes or quietly putting fresh fruit back on the shelf after checking the cost. It amazed me how much energy I spent protecting an image that existed only inside my own mind. Most people were simply buying groceries and going home. I was carrying invisible expectations everywhere I went. My husband noticed the change before I did. One evening, after the children were asleep, he sat beside me without saying anything for a long moment. Finally, he looked at me and asked a simple question. "When was the last time you felt relaxed?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I honestly couldn't remember. I had become so focused on surviving each week that I had forgotten what peace felt like. He gently reminded me that accepting temporary support didn't erase everything we had worked for. He said our children needed healthy parents more than perfect parents. Those words stayed with me because they challenged something I had believed for years. I thought being strong meant handling every problem alone. Maybe real strength meant protecting the people I loved, even if that required accepting help for a season. Around the same time, I kept practicing my English in small, everyday ways. I listened carefully to conversations at the library, read simple signs while shopping, and repeated short sentences aloud while driving. Learning slowly taught me patience. Some days I understood almost everything. Other days I struggled with simple expressions. Yet I kept going because improvement wasn't measured by perfection. It was measured by consistency. That lesson quietly spread into the rest of my life. Perhaps rebuilding confidence worked exactly the same way. One honest decision. One better habit. One small step repeated again and again. Then came the afternoon that tested everything I believed. My shopping cart held only the essentials: milk, bread, eggs, rice, vegetables, peanut butter, cereal, and a few snacks the children loved. Nothing felt unusual until I noticed the checkout line moving more slowly than expected. Suddenly I became aware of every person standing behind me. I could hear conversations, shopping carts rolling across the floor, and the soft beeping of scanners. My heart began beating faster for reasons I couldn't fully explain. My wallet suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Inside was the card I had spent weeks pretending didn't exist. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if this ordinary piece of plastic somehow carried all my fears inside it. I took a slow breath and looked at my children, who were smiling as they talked about what they wanted to cook together that weekend. They weren't thinking about pride. They weren't thinking about appearances. They were simply excited to spend time together as a family. In that quiet moment, I realized they were teaching me a lesson without even knowing it. They cared far more about love than image, far more about home than opinions. I didn't know it yet, but within the next few minutes, one ordinary checkout line would challenge every belief I had carried for years and begin changing my life in ways I never expected. The checkout that broke me. I had imagined this moment so many times that I was certain I knew exactly how it would end. I believed everyone in the grocery store would stop what they were doing, stare at me, and quietly decide what kind of person I was. My heart pounded as the cashier scanned each item with the familiar beep, beep, beep. Every sound felt louder than the last. Bread, milk, eggs, rice, apples, peanut butter, cereal, frozen vegetables. Nothing expensive. Nothing unnecessary. Just enough food for a family trying to make it through another week. My children stood beside the shopping cart talking about their favorite breakfast cereal as if it were the most exciting thing in the world. They were laughing. I was barely breathing. The total appeared on the screen, and suddenly it felt as though time had slowed down. I opened my wallet and looked at the EBT card again. My hand hesitated. For a brief second, I almost put it back. I thought about paying with my nearly empty debit card instead, even though I already knew it would not cover the bill. Pride whispered that it would be less embarrassing to leave without groceries than to let anyone know we needed help. Fear is strange that way. It often convinces us to choose a harder path just to protect an image that exists only in our imagination. The cashier smiled kindly and said, "Whenever you're ready." Her voice was calm, patient, and completely ordinary. She had probably helped hundreds of families that week alone. Yet my mind kept creating stories that weren't real. I imagined the people behind me judging every move I made. I imagined whispers that never happened. I imagined shame before anything had actually gone wrong. Taking a slow breath, I swiped the card. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the register gave a soft confirmation beep. Approved. That was it. No dramatic announcement. No curious looks. No uncomfortable questions. The cashier handed me the receipt exactly as she had done for every customer before me. She smiled and wished my family a wonderful afternoon. The woman behind me simply unloaded her groceries onto the belt without paying any attention to me. A father nearby was busy calming his crying toddler. Two teenagers were laughing about something on their phones. Life continued exactly as it had before I reached the register. The scene I had feared for weeks existed only inside my own mind. As I pushed the shopping cart toward the parking lot, something unexpected happened. Instead of relief, I started crying. Quietly at first, then harder than I had in years. Not because I felt humiliated. I cried because I realized how much unnecessary weight I had been carrying. I had spent months believing that accepting temporary support would erase my dignity. Instead, it gave my children healthy meals for the week. It gave my husband one less burden to carry. It gave our family room to breathe again. Sitting in the car, I looked at the grocery bags in the back seat. They looked so ordinary. Bread, fruit, yogurt, chicken, vegetables. Yet somehow those simple bags represented something much bigger. They represented hope replacing fear. Around that moment, I remembered something I had been practicing while learning English. Whenever I heard a new word I didn't understand, I used to avoid saying it because I was afraid of making mistakes. Later, I realized that improvement only came after I accepted sounding imperfect. The same truth was unfolding in my personal life. Growth began the moment I stopped pretending I could do everything alone. Psychologists often explain that shame becomes stronger when people hide it in silence, but it becomes weaker when reality proves our fears wrong. That afternoon, my worst prediction never came true. Nobody laughed. Nobody pointed. Nobody treated me differently. The loudest voice judging me had always been my own. When I arrived home, my husband helped carry the groceries inside. He didn't celebrate. He didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, he hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Sometimes love doesn't arrive through big speeches. Sometimes it arrives through quiet understanding. Our children happily unpacked the food, talking about dinners we could cook together that week. Watching them smile made me realize something I had almost forgotten. Children remember how safe they felt far more than how expensive the groceries were. That evening, our dinner tasted no different from any other meal, but my heart felt lighter than it had in months. I believed the hardest part of my journey was finally over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Accepting the card at the checkout was only the beginning. The real challenge would start the next morning, when I had to decide whether I would continue living for other people's opinions or begin building a future based on courage, gratitude, and the quiet confidence that my family deserved more than my pride ever could. My husband saw what I couldn't. The morning after that unforgettable trip to the grocery store, I expected to wake up feeling embarrassed all over again. Instead, I woke up feeling strangely quiet. The fear that had lived inside my chest for months had become smaller overnight, but something else had taken its place. Questions. Had I been making life harder than it needed to be? How many opportunities had I ignored simply because I was afraid of what other people might think? As I stood in the kitchen making breakfast, my husband walked in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and smiled as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me all night. "Don't you feel ashamed?" He looked at me with genuine surprise before answering. "Ashamed of feeding our children? Never." His words were so simple that they almost sounded too easy, yet they stayed with me for the rest of the day. I realized I had been measuring success through the eyes of imaginary critics instead of the people who actually loved me. My husband wasn't celebrating hardship. He wasn't saying our situation was perfect. He was reminding me that accepting temporary help during a difficult season was an act of responsibility, not failure. That single conversation quietly changed the direction of my thinking. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to our everyday life instead of constantly worrying about appearances. Dinner became more relaxed because I no longer calculated every bite of food in my head. Grocery shopping stopped feeling like an emotional test and slowly became what it was supposed to be, a normal family responsibility. We even found ourselves laughing more often around the dinner table. The children noticed it before we did. One evening, my youngest smiled and said, "Mom, you laugh a lot more now." Children have an amazing ability to notice emotional changes that adults often overlook. That innocent comment made me realize how much stress I had been carrying without even knowing it. Scientists who study family well-being have found that children benefit not only from stable nutrition, but also from emotionally available parents. When financial stress becomes overwhelming, it often affects patience, sleep, decision-making, and relationships. Reducing that pressure even a little can improve the emotional health of the entire family. I wasn't reading research papers back then, but I could see the results happening in my own home. We talked more. We smiled more. We worried a little less. My husband also encouraged me to keep improving my English, not because he expected perfection, but because he knew confidence grows through small daily victories. While shopping, I started asking simple questions instead of avoiding conversations. "Excuse me, where can I find whole wheat bread? Is this item on sale today? Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon." They were short sentences, but every successful conversation reminded me that progress comes from participation, not perfection. Funny enough, learning English and rebuilding my confidence began following the same pattern. Every small success made the next step feel a little easier. Every mistake became less frightening. One Saturday afternoon, we visited a local community event at a neighborhood park. Families were enjoying music, children were playing games, and volunteers were handing out information about local resources. A woman around my age started talking with me while our children played together. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that her family had once relied on food stamps after unexpected medical bills. She said it without lowering her voice, without embarrassment, and without apology. I was shocked not because she had needed help, but because she spoke about it with such honesty. She had a good job now. Her children were thriving. Her family had simply gone through a difficult chapter. Listening to her made me realize something I had never considered before. Many successful families have difficult seasons that nobody else ever sees. We usually meet people after they've recovered, not while they're struggling. That creates the illusion that everyone else has always been doing fine. It's simply not true. Later that evening, as my husband and I walked back to the car holding our children's hands, he quietly said, "See? We were never alone." I looked around at the families laughing together under the evening sky and finally understood what he meant. Strength wasn't pretending we never needed support. Strength was using every available opportunity to protect the people we loved while continuing to move forward. That realization lifted a burden I had carried for far too long. But another challenge was waiting for me, one I had never expected. Now that my pride was no longer controlling my decisions, I had to answer a new question. If I wasn't living for other people's approval anymore, who was I becoming? The answer would begin to reveal itself through the smallest daily habits. And those tiny changes would end up transforming our family far more than any financial assistance ever could. I stopped living for other people. One sentence changed the way I looked at my entire life, and the surprising part was that nobody said it to me. I said it to myself while looking into the bathroom mirror one quiet morning. I'm tired of trying to impress people who aren't living my life. The words sounded almost too simple, but they felt like unlocking a door that had been stuck for years. Until then, I had measured nearly every decision through invisible expectations. Would someone think I wasn't successful enough? Would another parent judge the groceries in my shopping cart? Would strangers assume I wasn't working hard? Those questions had quietly controlled my choices for far too long. That morning, I decided they would no longer decide my future. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. I didn't suddenly become fearless. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, I made one small promise. Every decision would be based on what truly helped my family, not on what protected my pride. That promise changed hundreds of ordinary moments. I stopped apologizing for buying affordable store-brand products. I stopped comparing our family to carefully edited lives on social media. I stopped pretending I wasn't tired when I was exhausted. The funny thing was that almost nobody noticed these changes except the people who mattered most. My husband noticed I smiled more often. My children noticed I had more patience during homework time. Even our evenings felt different. We started cooking together instead of rushing through dinner. We talked about our days without constantly worrying about bills. There were still challenges, of course. But the emotional weight felt lighter because I was no longer carrying unnecessary shame along with every problem. Researchers who study self-compassion often explain that people who treat themselves with kindness after setbacks usually recover faster and make better long-term decisions than people who constantly criticize themselves. At first, that idea sounded strange to me. I thought being hard on myself was the same as being responsible. Eventually, I learned they are very different. Responsibility helps you solve problems. Shame only convinces you that you are the problem. Once I understood that difference, everything began changing little by little. Around the same time, I continued practicing my English in the simplest ways possible. I listened carefully to announcements at the grocery store. I greeted neighbors without rehearsing every sentence in my head. I even started chatting with another mother while waiting outside my children's school. Sometimes I made grammar mistakes. Sometimes I searched for the right word. Something surprising happened every single time. Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Most people smiled, listened patiently, and responded with kindness. Those conversations taught me a lesson far bigger than vocabulary. Most people are far less interested in judging us than we imagine. They're usually busy thinking about their own lives, their own worries, and their own families. That realization gave me an unexpected sense of freedom. One afternoon, while organizing our kitchen, my daughter asked if she could help prepare dinner. As we chopped vegetables together, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, you don't look worried all the time anymore." I stopped cutting carrots for a moment because her words caught me completely by surprise. Children often notice emotional changes before adults do. She wasn't talking about money. She wasn't talking about food stamps. She was talking about peace. Somehow, without realizing it, I had started bringing calm back into our home. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone with a cup of tea and thought about how much had changed in only a few months. The food stamps program had certainly helped us buy groceries, but it hadn't changed my heart by itself. What truly changed me was learning to separate my worth from my circumstances. Financial hardship was something my family experienced. It was never my identity. Once I accepted that truth, I stopped seeing temporary support as a label and started seeing it as exactly what it was, a bridge that allowed us to keep moving forward. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how many opportunities people miss because they refuse help that could move them toward a better future. Pride often disguises itself as strength, but real strength usually looks much quieter. It looks like honest conversations, practical decisions, steady progress, and choosing your family's well-being over your own ego. I believed that lesson was the biggest one I would learn. Once again, life surprised me. The greatest transformation wasn't happening in my finances or even in my confidence. It was happening inside the daily habits that seemed far too small to matter. Those tiny routines, almost invisible at first, would slowly become the foundation for a completely different future, proving that extraordinary lives are often built through ordinary choices repeated with courage day after day. Small changes saved my family. If someone had visited our house a few months after that unforgettable grocery store experience, they probably would have been confused if I had told them our lives were changing. Nothing looked extraordinary. We hadn't won the lottery. We hadn't moved into a bigger house. We weren't driving a brand new car. From the outside, everything still looked wonderfully ordinary. Yet inside our home, almost everything felt different. That's the strange thing about real transformation. It usually arrives so quietly that you don't recognize it until you suddenly realize you're no longer the same person. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen after dinner, I noticed something that almost made me laugh. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't calculating next week's grocery budget while washing the dishes. My mind wasn't racing through unpaid bills or imagining worst-case scenarios. Instead, I was humming along with music playing softly in the background while my children finished their homework at the dining table. It was such a simple moment that another person might have forgotten it immediately. I never did. Peace doesn't always arrive as excitement. Sometimes it arrives as silence where anxiety used to live. My husband noticed these little moments too. Instead of spending every evening worrying about what might go wrong, we started talking about what could go right. We planned inexpensive family picnics at local parks. We created simple weekly meal plans together instead of making stressful last-minute decisions. We even started a small savings jar on the kitchen counter. Some weeks we added only a few dollars. Other weeks we couldn't add anything at all. The amount wasn't what mattered. The habit reminded us that progress grows from consistency rather than perfection. Behavioral scientists often describe this as the power of small, repeated actions. Tiny improvements may seem almost invisible from one day to the next, but over months and years they create remarkable change. Looking back, I realize our family's biggest victories didn't happen because of one dramatic decision. They happened because we kept making better choices on ordinary Tuesdays, quiet Thursdays, and sleepy Sunday mornings. Around the same time, I continued improving my English without putting pressure on myself. Every grocery trip became a chance to practice listening. Every conversation with a cashier became a speaking exercise. Sometimes I read simple recipes in English before cooking dinner. Other evenings, I listened to short stories while folding laundry after the children had gone to bed. Those little routines never felt like schoolwork. They became part of my daily life. Gradually, I noticed something surprising. I no longer translated every sentence inside my head before speaking. My confidence wasn't growing because my English had become perfect. It was growing because I had stopped being afraid of making mistakes. That lesson spread into every area of my life. One Saturday morning, our family volunteered at a neighborhood food pantry. At first, I wasn't sure whether I belonged there. A quiet voice inside me still whispered that someone might recognize me or ask uncomfortable questions. Instead, I met teachers, nurses, retired couples, college students, and young families all working together to help the community. Nobody cared about appearances. Everyone simply wanted to make sure families had enough food. One older volunteer smiled warmly and said something I have never forgotten. Life moves in seasons. Sometimes you receive. Sometimes you give. Both seasons matter. Those words settled deeply into my heart. For months, I had focused only on what my family had received. I had forgotten that one day we would also have opportunities to give back, even if our contribution seemed small. That afternoon, as I packed food boxes alongside complete strangers who quickly felt like neighbors, I realized dignity doesn't disappear when you accept help. In many ways, it grows stronger because gratitude teaches humility, and humility creates compassion. My children loved volunteering. They laughed while organizing canned goods and proudly handed bags to families with bright smiles. On the drive home, my youngest quietly asked, "Mom, are we helping people like us?" I looked at her through the rearview mirror and answered honestly, "Yes. And someday, they might help someone else too." She nodded as if the idea made perfect sense. Children often understand generosity more naturally than adults because they haven't yet learned to measure people's worth by their circumstances. That conversation stayed with me long after we arrived home. It reminded me that the greatest lesson my children were learning wasn't about money at all. They were learning empathy. They were learning that asking for help during a difficult season and offering help when life improves are both parts of being a strong community. As the weeks turned into months, our family became stronger in ways no bank statement could measure. We laughed more easily, argued less often, and dreamed about the future without fear controlling every conversation. Still, one important question continued following me everywhere I went. Had the food stamps program truly changed my life, or had it simply given me the chance to change myself? The answer would become clear during a conversation I never expected to have, and it would completely reshape the way I understood success, resilience, and what it really means to build a better future in America. Why pride keeps people stuck. One conversation in a supermarket completely changed the way I understood success. And the surprising part is that it happened with someone I had never met before. I wasn't expecting a life lesson that afternoon. I was simply picking up groceries, checking my shopping list, and thinking about what to cook for dinner. As I reached for a loaf of bread, I noticed an older woman standing nearby. She smiled and casually asked which brand my children liked best. We started talking about recipes, rising grocery prices, and how quickly kids seem to grow. Then, almost without warning, she quietly said something that made me stop pushing my shopping cart. Many years ago, food stamps helped my family too. She didn't whisper it. She didn't look embarrassed. She simply stated it as one ordinary fact among many others. If she hadn't mentioned it herself, I never would have guessed. She was confident, well-dressed, cheerful, and clearly comfortable with who she had become. I asked if she had ever felt ashamed. She smiled kindly and answered, "Only until I realized my pride wasn't paying my bills." We both laughed, but her words stayed in my mind long after our conversation ended. Driving home, I kept repeating that sentence. Pride wasn't paying my bills. Pride wasn't putting healthy food on the table. Pride wasn't reducing stress inside our home. The truth felt almost uncomfortable because it exposed something I had avoided for months. I had been protecting an image instead of protecting my peace. Psychologists often describe pride as something that can be either healthy or harmful. Healthy pride encourages responsibility, effort, and personal growth. Unhealthy pride refuses support even when accepting it would improve life for everyone involved. Looking back, I realized I had confused those two ideas for a long time. I believed independence meant never needing anyone. Real independence, however, includes making wise decisions, using available resources responsibly, and continuing to move forward even during difficult seasons. Once I understood that difference, many things finally made sense. Around the same time, I noticed another quiet change happening inside me. My English conversations were becoming more natural. I no longer memorized every sentence before speaking. If I forgot a word, I simply described what I meant and kept talking. Surprisingly, people almost always understood me. That experience reminded me that communication isn't about being perfect. It's about connecting with others. Life works the same way. Progress doesn't belong to people who never struggle. It belongs to people who keep showing up despite their struggles. One evening, while helping my son finish his homework, he became frustrated because he couldn't solve a math problem. He pushed his pencil aside and said, "Maybe I'm just not good at this." I recognized those words immediately because I had said almost the same thing to myself in different situations. Instead of giving him the answer, I asked him to try one more time using a different method. After a few minutes, he solved the problem on his own. His face lit up with excitement. Watching him celebrate reminded me that confidence doesn't appear before action. It usually appears after action. Researchers who study learning call this the confidence cycle. Small successes create belief, and belief encourages people to take the next step. That simple principle had quietly transformed my own life. Every conversation in English, every grocery trip, every honest decision. Every difficult moment I faced instead of avoiding became another piece of evidence that I was stronger than fear had convinced me. My husband noticed this change one evening as we walked through our neighborhood after dinner. He smiled and said, "You stand differently now." At first, I laughed because I thought he meant my posture. He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "You don't look like someone who's apologizing for existing anymore." I had never thought about it before, but he was right. Shame changes the way people carry themselves. It lowers their eyes, softens their voice, and convinces them to take up less space. Letting go of unnecessary shame had changed more than my attitude. It had changed the way I lived every ordinary day. Months earlier, I thought food stamps would become the most important chapter in my story. Instead, they became only the beginning. The real story was about changing the beliefs that had quietly controlled my choices for years. Those beliefs had nothing to do with groceries. They were about fear, identity, family, and the courage to accept that needing temporary help does not define a person's future. As I reflected on everything that had happened, one question continued growing louder inside my heart. If changing my mindset had transformed my family this much, what would happen if I used these lessons to help someone else who was still trapped behind the same invisible wall of pride? I didn't know it yet, but the answer was already waiting for me, and it would become the most meaningful part of my entire journey. The day I finally smiled again. I never expected that the moment proving my life had truly changed would happen in the same place where I once felt the deepest shame. It wasn't at home. It wasn't during a family celebration. It wasn't when our finances became more stable. It happened in the grocery store where I had once stood frozen, convinced that everyone was judging me. This time, as I pushed my shopping cart through the familiar aisles, I noticed a young mother standing at the checkout counter. She looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she searched through her wallet. I recognized that expression immediately because it had once stared back at me in the mirror. She looked exactly like I had looked months earlier, exhausted, worried, and carrying far more emotional weight than anyone around her could possibly see. The cashier patiently waited while the woman apologized several times for taking too long. Nobody in line seemed upset, but I could almost hear the thoughts racing through her mind because they had once raced through mine. Then she quietly reached for an EBT card. For a brief second, she lowered her eyes as though hoping to become invisible. My heart immediately remembered that feeling. Without thinking too much, I caught her eye and simply smiled. Not a smile of pity. Not a smile of sympathy. Just a warm smile that quietly said, "You're going to be okay." She looked surprised for a moment before smiling back. It lasted only a few seconds, but something powerful happened inside me. Months earlier, I had believed using food stamps would become the most embarrassing memory of my life. Instead, that experience had given me the ability to recognize someone else's silent struggle with compassion rather than judgment. As I walked toward the parking lot, I realized I wasn't carrying shame anymore. I was carrying understanding. That difference changed everything. Researchers who study compassion often explain that people who have experienced hardship themselves frequently become more empathetic toward others. Facing similar challenges. Difficult seasons, when approached with reflection instead of bitterness, can strengthen emotional resilience and deepen human connection. Looking back, I could see that happening in my own life. My family had not become stronger because life suddenly became easy. We had become stronger because we stopped pretending that struggle made us less worthy. That realization quietly transformed the atmosphere inside our home. Dinner conversations became filled with gratitude instead of anxiety. We celebrated small victories that we once ignored. My daughter proudly showed us a good grade on her spelling test. My son excitedly talked about helping a classmate with homework. My husband came home smiling after receiving positive feedback at work. Months earlier, our worries would have drowned out those happy moments. Now we actually pause to enjoy them. It wasn't because every problem had disappeared. It was because hope had finally become louder than fear. I also continued practicing English in ways that fit naturally into everyday life. I borrowed simple books from the local library, listened to slow English stories while preparing dinner, and spoke a little more confidently whenever I had the chance. Something interesting happened during those conversations. People weren't impressed because my English was perfect. They appreciated that I was willing to communicate. That lesson mirrored everything else I had learned. Progress isn't about waiting until you're flawless. It's about showing up consistently with courage, even while you're still learning. One weekend, our family returned to the community food pantry where we had volunteered before. This time, I met a woman who quietly admitted she felt embarrassed about asking for assistance. I listened without interrupting because I remembered exactly how those emotions felt. When she finished speaking, I gently told her a small part of my own story. I didn't try to solve her problems. I didn't pretend to have all the answers. I simply shared the truth that had changed my life. Accepting temporary help doesn't reduce your value as a person. Sometimes it protects the future you're working so hard to build. Tears filled her eyes, and before leaving she thanked me for saying the one thing she needed to hear. As I watched her walk away with her family, I realized something beautiful. My hardest season had quietly become someone else's source of hope. That realization brought a deeper happiness than I could ever have imagined. For the first time in years, I no longer defined my life by what I lacked. I defined it by what I had learned. I had learned that love grows stronger when pride becomes smaller. I had learned that families become more resilient when they face challenges together instead of hiding them. I had learned that courage often looks ordinary, arriving through simple decisions repeated every single day. Most importantly, I had learned that my story wasn't ending with food stamps. It was beginning with gratitude. Yet one final discovery still waited ahead. A realization so unexpected that it would completely change the way I answered the question people asked me most often. What really changed your life? My answer would surprise almost everyone, including the version of myself who once believed a small plastic card could determine her worth. Food stamps didn't change me, my mind did. People sometimes ask me the same question after hearing my story. So, did food stamps change your life? Every time I hear that question, I pause for a moment because the answer is both yes and no. Yes, the program helped my family during one of the most difficult seasons we had ever faced. It gave us breathing room when every grocery trip felt like a battle. It reduced the pressure that had quietly followed us into every meal, every conversation, and every sleepless night. But if I'm completely honest, the card itself wasn't the biggest reason my life changed. The real transformation happened inside my mind, and once that change began, Everything else slowly followed. Looking back now, I can clearly see two different versions of myself. The first woman believed that asking for help meant losing her dignity. She measured her value by how independent she appeared to other people. She spent more energy protecting her image than protecting her own peace. The second woman still faced challenges, still worried about the future sometimes, and still made mistakes. But she no longer believed that temporary hardship defined her identity. She understood that accepting support during a difficult season was not the end of her story. It was simply one chapter. That difference changed the way I spoke, the way I made decisions, and even the way I smiled. Around this time, our family finances slowly became more stable. It didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic breakthrough or lucky surprise. My husband continued working hard, and I kept improving my own skills little by little. We learned how to budget more carefully, plan meals more efficiently, and avoid unnecessary expenses without feeling deprived. Those habits didn't make us rich, but they gave us something far more valuable: confidence. Confidence grows when people begin trusting themselves to handle whatever comes next. Researchers often explain that resilience is built through repeated experiences of overcoming manageable challenges rather than avoiding them. Altogether, looking back, I realized every obstacle our family had faced became part of that process. None of those difficult days felt meaningful while we were living through them, yet together they quietly built a stronger version of who we became. My English continued improving in exactly the same way. I never woke up one morning suddenly fluent. Instead, I noticed small victories that gradually became normal. I could understand conversations more easily while shopping. I could ask questions without rehearsing every sentence in my head. I even found myself helping another parent during a school event when she couldn't find the correct classroom. Months earlier, I would have stayed silent because I was afraid of making mistakes. Now I simply smiled, spoke slowly, and trusted that communication mattered more than perfection. That lesson reached far beyond language. It became my philosophy for life. Progress belongs to people who are willing to begin before they feel completely ready. One evening, while cleaning old papers from a kitchen drawer, I found the original food stamps approval letter. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Months earlier, I would have hidden that envelope immediately because seeing it reminded me of failure. This time, I smiled. Instead of shame, I felt gratitude. That single piece of paper represented a bridge that had helped my family reach safer ground. It reminded me that temporary support had allowed us to protect our children's well-being while rebuilding our confidence step by step. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the drawer, not because I wanted to hide it, but because it had become part of our family history. Every family has chapters they don't expect to write. Ours simply happened to include a lesson about humility, resilience, and the courage to accept help when it truly mattered. Later that night, my husband looked at me and asked a question I will never forget. If you could speak to the woman you were 1 year ago, what would you tell her? I thought about it for a long time before answering. Finally, I smiled and said, I would tell her that people aren't watching as closely as she thinks. I would tell her that her children need her peace more than they need her pride. And I would tell her that asking for help today can become the reason someone else finds hope tomorrow. He reached across the table and gently held my hand. Neither of us said anything else because there was nothing left to explain. We both knew how far our family had come. As I looked around our quiet home that evening, I realized something beautiful. The greatest gift we had received wasn't financial assistance. It was the opportunity to replace fear with wisdom, shame with gratitude, and isolation with connection. Still, one final chapter remained. There was one message I wanted every person listening to this story to remember long after the video ended. Because if my journey had taught me anything, it was that one invisible habit silently steals more dreams than poverty ever could, and recognizing it may completely change the future you are building today. Never let pride steal tomorrow. If you remember only one part of my story after this video ends, I hope it's not the grocery store, the EBT card, or even the difficult season my family experienced. I hope you remember the simple truth. Pride should never become more important than the people you love. Looking back now, I can honestly say that the biggest obstacle standing between me and a better future was never a lack of money. It wasn't the rising cost of groceries. It wasn't uncertainty. It was the quiet voice inside my own mind that kept whispering, "Handle everything alone or people will think you failed." That voice sounded convincing for a long time, but it was wrong. It almost convinced me to reject the very support that helped my family stay healthy, hopeful, and united. Today, when I walk through the same neighborhood where I once felt embarrassed, I notice something completely different. I don't wonder whether people are judging me anymore. Instead, I notice children riding bicycles, neighbors walking their dogs, families laughing in front yards, and ordinary people living ordinary lives. Everyone is carrying something invisible. Some are worried about health. Others are caring for aging parents. Some are rebuilding after losing a job. Others are quietly struggling with loneliness. We rarely know the full story behind another person's smile. That realization has made me slower to judge and much quicker to offer kindness. Our family is in a much stronger place now than we were when this story began. We still plan our budget carefully because good habits never go out of style. We still appreciate every meal around the dinner table because gratitude has become part of our daily routine. My husband and I continue encouraging each other instead of carrying stress in silence. Our children are growing into thoughtful, compassionate young people who understand that a person's character is measured by kindness, honesty, and perseverance, not by temporary circumstances. Looking at them today fills my heart with hope because I know they learned an important lesson much earlier than I did. There is strength in accepting help when help is truly needed, and there is honor in giving back when you are able. My own journey with English has continued in exactly the same spirit. I still learn new words. I still discover expressions I have never heard before. Sometimes I still make mistakes, and that's perfectly fine. Every conversation is another opportunity to improve. Every story becomes another lesson. That's one reason I love sharing experiences like this through slow English storytelling. Language becomes easier to remember when it is connected to real emotions, real families, and real life. Perhaps as you've listened today, you've practiced your English without even realizing it. More importantly, I hope you've also practiced seeing yourself with a little more compassion. Psychological research consistently shows that hope grows when people believe change is possible through small, meaningful actions. You don't have to transform your entire life this week. You don't have to solve every problem tomorrow morning. Sometimes the most powerful decision is simply choosing not to let fear make today's choices for tomorrow's future. That is exactly where my own life began to change. Not when everything became easy, but when I stopped allowing pride to speak louder than wisdom. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had continued saying no to every opportunity for support. I might have protected my ego for a little while, but I would have sacrificed peace inside my home. Thankfully, my story took a different path. It became a story about resilience instead of regret, about family instead of fear, and about quiet courage instead of silent shame. If you're watching this today while carrying a burden that nobody else can see, I hope my experience reminds you that difficult seasons do not last forever. Temporary challenges are not permanent identities. Accepting help does not make you weak. Learning something new one step at a time is never too late. Loving your family well is always something to be proud of. And sometimes, the bravest decision you'll ever make is simply allowing yourself to move forward instead of standing still because of fear. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to share one of the most personal chapters of my life. I truly hope this slow English story has helped you practice your listening while also reminding you that hope often arrives in ordinary moments. The future didn't change because I received a card. The future changed because I finally believed my family deserved peace more than my pride deserved protection. That belief continues shaping my life every single day, and I hope it encourages you to keep moving forward, one small step at a time. That's all for today. I'll be making many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next one.